Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. The topic is Ayurveda, a mere introduction. What is Ayurveda? It's an ancient Indian system of medicine, complete in itself. So some of the terms which are used sometimes as alternative and complementary are in fact very inappropriate. It is not an alternative to something else if what we think is real medicine does not work. This in itself is a system of medicine complete in itself. Secondly, complementary means as if there is a puzzle which is all complete, there's one piece missing, and that missing piece can be supplied by a system like Ayurveda, so it becomes complementary to what is actually the main body of medicine. It is not a complement to some other type of medicine. It's a complete system of medicine in itself. And it is a holistic system. Holistic in the true sense that it takes into account the totality of the person, which is what integral philosophy, integral yoga, integral education are all about. This is integral health rather than integral medicine, because Ayurveda is more about health than disease, as any system of medicine should be. So it takes into account not only the body and the mind of the person, but also the soul. So it is holistic in the true sense. This is what David Frawley has said about Ayurveda in his preface to his book, Ayurveda and the Mind. David Frawley is an American, but he is more Indian than American. And he has written several books on Ayurveda as well as yoga and the Vedas. Ayurveda is the extraordinary mind-body medicine of India with its great spiritual tradition, a tremendous resource for bringing wholeness to all levels of our existence. It is one of the world's oldest and most complete systems of natural healing, containing great wisdom for all humanity that all of us should know. And fortunately, most of us in India do have some idea of it because it has become folk knowledge. It is knowledge that is passed on from generation to generation, and a lot of folk wisdom related to health and disease, particularly when it comes to foods and spices and so on, is in fact has its origin in fact in Ayurveda. Bringing out the relationship between Ayurveda and yoga, in the same book, David Frawley says, Ayurveda is the healing branch of yogic science. On the other hand, yoga is the spiritual aspect of Ayurveda, while Ayurveda is the therapeutic branch of yoga. In a simple way, the way I have been looking at it is that Ayurveda is a system of medicine, and like any system of medicine, it's concerned primarily with health and disease. But all the same, Ayurveda uses yoga for its health benefits. Yoga has some health benefits, and Ayurveda makes full use of those benefits by bringing yoga into it, incorporating yoga into it in a seamless fashion, and not just the physical practices of yoga or just the practices like meditation, but also its philosophy in its entirety. So Ayurveda uses yoga in its most comprehensive sense for its health benefits. On the other hand, yoga is a spiritual discipline. It's not a system of medicine. But all the same, it does give us good health. And since it is a system that was designed primarily for spiritual growth, not for taking care of our health, one can say that the health benefits of yoga are a side effect, a fringe benefit. Now let's look at the underlying philosophy of Ayurveda. One of the most important things in this philosophy is that individuals are different, and therefore their behavior in relation to health and disease can be different. The type of treatment that they may need in disease can be different. So individuals are different, and therefore what is important is not only to think of health and disease, but also who is the person who is to be kept healthy, and who is the person who has to be helped in recovering health if the person is not well. So these individual differences have great importance in Ayurveda. Individuals are different both psychologically and physically, and Ayurveda takes care of both. The psychological constitution of a person, or the way individuals are different psychologically, is in Ayurveda exactly the same as it is in yoga. Particularly, we find its full expression in the Gita. The three basic gunas, or the three basic, you can say, components of personality. One can even call them the three primary colors of personality. Just as you can mix the three primary colors and get a very wide variety of hues, in the same way, using these three elements of psychological elements, one can mix them in different proportions and permutations and combinations and get a astronomical variety of personalities. But then what are these three? Most of you may be familiar with them already. Sattva is the element of knowledge and harmony. Rajas is the element of kinetic activity, ambitions, desires, and passions. It is sattva which can, if it is mixed with rajas, it is sattva which can temper rajas and give it an ethical turn. Because unbridled rajas can be very unscrupulous. It's concerned only with the satisfaction of its desires, its passions and ambitions. Rajas does not bother about what is right and wrong. That element comes from sattva. So sattva is the element of knowledge, which includes knowledge of good and bad, right and wrong. Tamas is the principle of inertia and ignorance. So laziness, confusion, bewilderment, that comes from tamas. But then all three have a role to play, and that is why they are there. Tamas does help us achieve a certain amount of stability and establish a certain sort of routine in life, which we can follow in autopilot mode. Now, those are also expressions of tamas. And each one of us has each of these three elements in different proportions. So the dominant principle may be different, but we have a bit of all these three in us. The question arises, should the psychological constitution be changed, and can it be changed? We have a certain personality now. Is there any need to change it? And can it be changed? Yes, it should be changed, because no matter how we are now, we can always get better. And that is possible, and that is what yoga is about. To move from tamas towards rajas and from rajas to sattva. So that is what the basic sort of aim of the sadhana in yoga is, to move from tamas to rajas and from rajas to sattva, and that is possible. And finally, to go beyond all the three gunas. That is the final goal of yoga, when we are not bound by any of these manifestations of nature or the prakriti. So it should be changed, and it can be changed. Now let's look at the physical constitution, which is not there in yoga but is there in Ayurveda. This is again based on three basic principles, or three humors, or the three doshas as they are called in Ayurveda. Here, dosha does not really mean a fault. It is just a sort of a component in the physical constitution. And the three types of doshas are vata, pitta, and kapha. Vata is light, mobile. Pitta is hot, fiery, and sort of what digests the food and so on. Kapha is what provides stability, heavy. So these are the three basic elements in or doshas, or in terms of Ayurveda. But then, are these three just purely physical? They also have a certain psychological component, although they have physical counterparts. For example, a person with vata predominance is likely to be thin and finds it very difficult to put on weight. A person with a pitta constitution can gain weight easily, but can also lose weight quite easily. And the person may not be as thin and lean as the vata prakriti. Whereas the person with a kapha prakriti is generally stout, stocky in build, gains weight very easily, but finds it very difficult to lose weight. And there are many other characteristics, and there are whole sort of charts and questionnaires available, which you can use. They are there on the net also, so many of them, by which you can assess what type of a prakriti you have. But then, is prakriti purely physical? No, prakriti is, what these three elements together in the individual are called. So is this type of physical constitution purely physical? No, it also has a psychological component. And our Ayurveda expert, Dr. Katoch, who will also interact with you during the next few weeks, uh, she puts it very nicely. She says, suppose a young person who is going for an interview for a job, uh, is at the railway station. He has to travel a few hours to reach the place where the interview is, and he has decided to go by train. This person has been unemployed for a long time, and therefore this is a very important event in his life, and he's looking forward to the interview and is praying that he should be successful. But then when he reaches the railway station, there's an announcement that the train is 2 hours late. Now, if the train is 2 hours late, he will miss the interview. Now, how do people with Vata, Pitta and Kapha predominance respond in this type of a situation? The person with Vata predominance starts pacing up and down the platform. I'm gone. It's the end of life. What will happen to me? I'm always unlucky. Such things always keep happening to me. I don't know what to do. That will be the person with the Vata predominance. What does the Pitta dominant person do? Why is the train late? Where is the station master? This is a very important event for me. I can't afford to miss it. These people in the railways don't work properly. I'll go and complain to the station master. And if need be, I'll go to the chairman of the railway board. I'll go to the railway minister. I'll go even to the prime minister. I'll not leave these people till I find out why this train was late. Now, this is a Pitta Prakriti. How does a person with a Kapha Prakriti respond? He says, well, the train is 2 hours late. I can afford to go by a taxi. And that's the other alternative. So he goes out, looks for a taxi, and gets the job interview. So these are three different types of responses typically of a person with a Vata predominance, the Pitta predominance, and the Kapha predominance. So it's not purely physical. These three doshas also have a psychological counterpart. Now, using these three, there are broadly speaking 7 types of Prakriti. Vata predominant, Pitta predominant, and Kapha predominant. Then Vata Pitta, Pitta Kapha, and Vata Kapha. And Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, all three more or less equal. Samadosh Prakriti. Now you may ask, which is the Prakriti which is good? There's nothing like good Prakriti or bad Prakriti when it comes to the combination of these doshas. In Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, yes, one can say Sattva is better than Rajas and Rajas is better than Tamas. But here there is nothing like a good or a bad dosha. And it's just that our susceptibility to disease changes. The season in which we may fall sick changes depending upon the predominance of the dosha that we have in our physical constitution. You might say that, well, Samadosh Prakriti should be probably the best because it has equal elements of all the three. To some extent it is, because a person with a Samadosh Prakriti falls ill less often. But then the other side of the coin is that the person with Samadosh Prakriti, once this person is ill, finds it more difficult also to recover from illness. But the fact is that none of these can be called good or bad. And moreover, while one may like to change one's physical constitution, it cannot be changed. We are born with a certain type of physical constitution at birth, and more or less it remains the same throughout life. There may be a certain change with age. You know, in Ayurveda, everything follows the sequence Kapha, Pitta, and Vata. To start with, everything is Kapha, in the middle it is Pitta, and then it is Vata. So a child may have a little more of Kapha, and an old person might have a little more of Vata. But that is an age-related change. But by and large, the basic physical constitution of a person is determined at birth and stays the same and cannot be changed. So now let's see what are the implications of the physical constitution. A person with a Vata Prakriti in general has a low immunity. One with Pitta predominance has a moderate immunity, and the one with Kapha has a high levels of immunity. The diseases which are more likely in these are just examples. These can be multiplied. The person with Vata Prakriti may be more susceptible to diseases of the nervous system, the one with the predominance of Pitta to the skin diseases, and the one with the Kapha Prakriti to diabetes and heart disease. It's not just the doshas of the person which determine health and disease, it's also the foods that the person takes. And foods also have a tendency to aggravate or pacify a particular dosha. So foods may be kapha aggravating or kapha pacifying, vata aggravating or vata pacifying, and so on. Not only that, there is also seasonal variation in the dominant dosha. So during different seasons, and there are 6 seasons according to Ayurveda, 2 months each in a year. So in these 6 seasons, the dominant dosha changes, and accordingly, the type of foods that will be best in that season change. The foods which should be avoided in that season, they change, and the type of diseases that a person may get in those, they also change. So there's seasonal variation in the dominant dosha. And at the junction of each of these 2-month periods, there is a short period of a few weeks, which is called Ritu Sandhi. That is when one type of season is making a transition to the next. And these Ritu Sandhi periods are particularly bad for health, and one has to be particularly careful in making a slow and cautious transition from one type of diet to another type of diet during this Ritu Sandhi period. In India, this is folk knowledge, mausam badal raha hai, dhyan rakho. This is something that the season is changing. Be careful, you may fall ill. Just a little cold wind and you may catch a cold. It may not happen in the month of December or January, more likely in October and November. Mausam badal raha hai. So Ritu Sandhi periods are particularly bad. Then time of the day has a dominant dosha again. The 24 hours of the day are roughly divided into 6 periods of 4 hours each. And so there is a beginning, middle, and the end of the day, beginning, middle, and the end of the night. And the beginning is from 6 to 10. So 6 to 10 in the morning is the beginning of the day, 10 to 2 is the middle of the day, and 2 to 6 is the end of the day. And then 6 to 10 in the evening is the beginning of the night, 10 to 2 is the middle of the night, 2 to 6 at night is the end of night. So at the beginning, in both day and night, it is kapha, middle is pitta, and the end is vata. Now pitta is the digestive fire, and that is at its peak from 10 to 2 during the middle of the day. So that is the rationale behind saying that the lunch should be the heaviest meal of the day, because that is when our digestive fire is at its peak. But then you might say, what is pitta doing at night? At night also from 10 to 2, we have pitta dominance. Probably at that time, it is helping us digest the food, gear up our metabolism, tune our metabolism of various nutrients, because the nutrients are still circulating in the blood. And that is perhaps also the reason that if a person is awake, and a lot of people are awake these days during this period from 10 p.m. till 2 a.m., 10 to 2, the middle of the night, if a person happens to be awake at that time, the person starts feeling hungry. So that hunger is probably because of the pitta dominance. But at the same time, that is not the right time to eat. That should be the time when the person should be asleep. And again, if one were to think of it in a logical fashion, what it would mean is that if the day is for staying awake and working and the night for sleeping, one can't be sleeping for 12 hours. If 12 hours is night, you can't sleep for 12 hours. But 8 hours is reasonable. So you take 2 hours away from this side and 2 hours from the other side, which means if the night begins at 6, sleep at about 8. And if the night ends at 6, wake up at 4. So 8 p.m. to 4 a.m., 8 hours of sleep, probably that would be in a way the best. Now let's concentrate a little more on nutrition. Ayurvedic nutrition. Ayurvedic nutrition takes into account the prakriti of the individual, the effect of the food, whether that food aggravates or pacifies a particular dosha, and the season, that is what is the dominant dosha of the season. And the dominant dosha of the season can be of 2 types. One is called the sanchaya, or the collection or accumulation of the dosha, and the other is the prakopa, or the vitiation of that dosha. The dosha is vitiated or it is just accumulated. And being vitiated is more dangerous than just being accumulated. So there are two types of dominance again. Now, how do we combine this to make a selection? Say, to take an example, these days it's Vasant Ritu going on. From the middle of March till the middle of May, these 2 months are Vasant Ritu. And during Vasant Ritu, the there's a kapha prakopa, that is vitiated kapha. And therefore, if a person has kapha predominance, that is when this person is likely to also get the diseases to which he is more vulnerable because of the kapha predominance. So what is that this person should be doing? Being a little more careful about the type of foods that this person takes during this season. As far as possible, avoid foods which are kapha aggravating and emphasize foods which are kapha pacifying. Now, which are the foods which are kapha aggravating? Foods which are heavy, fried foods, and sweets. And in general, the tastes to be avoided are sweet, salty, and sour. And the tastes to be emphasized are katu titiksha kashaya, that is bitter, sharp, pungent, and astringent. So these are the three tastes which are to be preferred. But all the same, the general principle is that one should have all the tastes during every meal as far as possible. So it's not; these are relative. These are not absolute. That one cannot take any sweet at all, or one cannot take any salty food. That of course will be almost impossible during this season. But all the same, less of sweets, and certainly less of heavy and fried foods, less of slimy foods, and avoid curd. Now, these are some of the precautions which can be taken to escape the effects of kapha predominance during this season. And this would be particularly important if the person in his prakriti has kapha predominance. So this is how one can use this knowledge to make a proper selection of food during a particular season, and that will change also with the individual because of the individual's prakriti. But then there is something which dominates all this and can overcome to some extent the ill effects of all this. And what is that? The foods not only have a kapha promoting or vata promoting or pitta promoting effect, they also have a sattva, rajas or tamas promoting effect. And this is something which applies to everybody. Now that's a blanket recommendation. As far as possible, go in for foods which promote sattva. Generally we call them sattvic foods. That's a simplification. It's not the food in itself which is sattvic. It is the person who is sattvic, rajasic and tamasic. That's what the Gita says. But then a person with a sattvic tendency, a sattvic type of personality is likely to have a taste for a certain type of foods. And those are the foods which also happen to be sattva promoting. Now, what are those foods? Foods which are good for health. Sattva is the element of knowledge. So this person knows what is good for me. He doesn't have great attachment to sensory pleasures, and therefore he chooses what is good for his health. And in general, sattva likes everything sweet and harmonious, so this person likes sweet foods, particularly sweet fruits. So liking fruits and sweet fruits and vegetables and selection of healthy foods is what comes naturally to a sattvic person. On the other hand, the rajasic person is more active, full of passions and desires, and therefore this person is likely to appreciate food which promotes sensory satisfaction. So he's more likely to have a taste for sour foods, salty foods, fried foods, and so on. Non-vegetarian food, and so on. So these are the types of taste that the rajas dominant person will have. Tamas is the element of inertia. Now, this person, because of his inertia and ignorance, because of his ignorance, he may not know what is good for me, and therefore he may not be able to choose wisely. But then he also is lazy. Inertia means lazy, translates into laziness. So he would much rather have stale food than take the effort of cooking the food. And therefore, this person may be quite happy with stale food. Stale and unhealthy food is what a tamasic person likes. Now here one may bring in another element that even a sattva promoting food if taken out of greed in excess, has a tamasic effect. And therefore, eating much more than we need can become tamasic irrespective of what we are eating, which means that the selection of the foods has to be proper, keeping in mind the prakriti of the person and the season and the effect of the food. And then within that, we also try to emphasize sattva promoting foods. But then what we also have to keep in mind that we do not eat too much. We eat a moderate amount. And how do we do that? A dictum given in Ayurveda is, imagine as if your stomach has 4 parts. Fill half of the stomach with food, another 1/4 with water, and leave the remaining 1/4 empty. The spirit behind this recommendation would be that do not go on eating till you can't eat anymore. Stop eating when you still can eat a little more, but you are reasonably full, and stop. That is the point at which one should stop eating. Another thing which one can bring in here at this point is that to some extent, every food has a certain amount of tamas in it. That is because all the food that we take is essentially dead material which was once living. And anything which is dead is tamasic. So to some amount of tamas enters with every food. And that is what you heard, one of the passages by Sri Aurobindo Adi Mother, when Tara Didi was reading it in the inaugural session. They both talked about this tamas entering the body and how we can try to neutralize its effect. For neutralizing its effect, we have to again turn to the divine, and which means that we have to eat the food in a proper, mindful manner, with an attitude of gratitude, with the prayer that let this food be converted in my body into something that will activate my prana once again. Although, this food had prana once upon a time, now that prana is totally dormant. Let that prana awake and let it sort of mingle with the prana of my own body in the most meaningful manner. So it is basically a recycling of elements on a very large scale that is going on in nature, in the Mahayagya of nature. And the energy which is being tracked from sunlight is being used by the plants for activating their own prana. And that is packed in the plant. By the time we take it, the plant is dead. As far as possible, it should be fresh, therefore. At least it has been, the plant has died only a short while ago. So fresh plant food is the one way in which this prana can be revived perhaps most easily. So that is the rationale behind this type of recommendation: fresh foods, uncooked food, and so on and so forth. But all the same, Ayurveda is a very pragmatic and practical type of a discipline, and therefore does not go to extremes of recommendations. But the general principles of Ayurveda are useful, and some of it you might have realized is in fact folk wisdom. A little more detail one can learn from experts in Ayurveda or by reading books on Ayurveda. But a lot of these concepts might resonate with particularly the Indians who are listening, because a lot of it is folk knowledge. So the general principle is that keeping in mind the prakriti of the individual, the effect of the food and the season, we also add to that the element of emphasizing sattva promoting foods, and that will to some extent neutralize even if some mistakes have been made otherwise in the selection of the food. Sattva promoting foods and not overeating. These two things will compensate to some extent for other mistakes. But then Ayurveda has many other considerations also. The time of the day when one should eat, the time in which meal should be light and heavy, the timings of the meals, the frequency of the meals, the interval between the meals, the quantity of food to be taken at each meal, the sequence in which various items should be taken at a meal. These are all considerations about which modern scientific nutrition is essentially silent. Silent because it is largely ignorant. But that doesn't mean that all these things are unimportant. They could have implications for health. And one of the things which I can take up amongst these things about which modern science is totally more or less silent is the concept of incompatible foods, or what is called in Ayurveda Viruddha Ahar. That is, which are the foods which cannot be mixed with each other at the same meal. Now, this is something which modern science does not care about, because basically it's the same chemical elements, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and vitamins and minerals in all the foods. What is the harm if one set of nutrients from one food is combined with another, the same set of nutrients from another food? What is wrong with it? The modern science doesn't understand that. And if I may go back in time, my attitude was also exactly the same. I thought all this little folk knowledge that came to me from here and there, from my elders and the environment, that this should not be taken with this and this should not be taken with this, I thought is all old, obsolete superstitions. That is the impression with which I grew, particularly because I felt that if the medicine that I have studied for such a long time has not taught me this, probably all these things don't matter. Now let's take a few examples to understand this. One of the most frequent violations of this concept of Viruddha Ahar is at breakfast. A lot of people take milk at breakfast, and along with that they eat something. And what they eat is generally salty. It has salt. And according to Ayurveda, this is incompatible. In general, milk is incompatible with just about everything except sweets and dry fruit. And particularly bad is milk and sour food and milk and non-vegetarian food. But milk and salty food is also incompatible. That is also Viruddha Ahar. Now, one of the common responses of people would be, I have been doing that for the last 40 years and I have not died. So what is the problem? And that is the way I also thought, because I have also eaten breakfast like that till at least maybe 10-15 years ago. Till the age of about 60, I have also eaten milk with a salty food as breakfast, and I didn't die. But then, when I consulted an Ayurvedic expert 10-15 years ago, Dr. Katoch again, the same person in the ashram, because of my rather frequent problems related to skin and some problems related to the muscles, or you might say subcutaneous sort of soft tissue pains, pains here and there, pain here and there, shifting sometime here, sometimes there. So for these two things, I consulted her. And after making some assessment of my prakriti, she made dietary recommendations, and she told me something about Viruddha Ahar, and this is, she said, should not be combined. So I took that advice and stopped taking milk in the morning. Now I take milk at night, at dinner with dry fruit. I don't take normal dinner at all. And that, according to Ayurveda, is okay, because strictly speaking, one needs only 2 meals a day. So 2 major meals, and at night only a bedtime drink of milk with some dry fruit. So that's what I'm consuming these days. Now, and a few other precautions also she told me, and I observed them to the extent I could. And the result has been that over the last 10-15 years, both these problems have more or less completely disappeared. So I didn't die because of eating milk and salty foods. But all the same, I was getting some problems. And for these, what would the modern system of medicine do? If I have a skin problem, apply this ointment. And the ointment was applied and it got all right. And during a certain season, it was more likely to be there. During the rest of the year, it was not there, and I forgot everything. Same thing was true of those soft tissue pains. But the fact is, which means that the effects can be rather subtle and long-term. Death is an acute effect and a severe effect. Side effects need not be acute and severe as death. Side effect can be just extremely subtle, very difficult to notice, and slow to appear. Another thing which I started feeling also is that many of the precautions which are given in Ayurveda about what is incompatible and so on may not apply that much to young people, because they can get away with just about everything. As the digestive fire becomes a little weaker, which is inevitable with age, these things may become more important. So the age, as well as the slow and subtle effects, which are very difficult to notice and objectify, may be as important as the gross effects which we look at, and on that basis decide that what is wrong with milk and salty foods. Everybody takes it. I have been taking it for 40 years. I haven't died. That is the type of arguments people give. But there are logical and sensible answers to that type of an objection. Now let's go to another example, which many of you would say, yes, this definitely is a no-no. Yeah? Fish and milk. And the threat is that one gets leukoderma if you take fish and milk together. How far these are related, one can't say. But all the same, any non-vegetarian food, particularly fish and milk, is a strict no-no in Ayurveda. And again, if I may go back to my own personal sort of life, at the age of 22, I was in England. And I was staying in a medical college hostel. And at breakfast, very often, the breakfast was fish cutlets and milk. Those days, I was a non-vegetarian. I turned vegetarian at the age of 45. That was when I was 22. My medical course was almost going to be over in another few months. So I knew essentially what modern medicine had to teach me till at least the graduation level of graduation. I had not learned anything why fish and milk should be incompatible. And I saw so many people around me, all those British students, taking fish cutlets and milk. So I thought, if they can take it and nothing happens to them, why will anything happen to me? That was my logic. And I took it and nothing happened. I took them together, nothing happened, I escaped. But today I would hesitate a lot before I did any such experiments with myself or with anybody. The reason is that what I overlooked at that time was the fact that if something is incompatible, it may not lead to an equal degree of damage in everybody, the same type of damage in everybody. And particularly if a particular population has been accustomed to a certain combination for several generations, they might have an adaptation, which a few days back Bhaswati Bhattacharya referred to, the epigenetic effect. Because of which the British medical students may not, or Britishers may not get anything, but I as an Indian could have perhaps run into trouble with the same combination. Fortunately, I didn't. But all the same, when we try to be rational and logical, we sometimes forget that that has so many angles to it that it cannot simplistic logic sometimes is not necessarily the best thing to resort to when it comes to safety or health and disease issues. So that was about fish and milk. But then you will learn about many others, including some which can be really dangerous and can lead to death or almost death. That type of incompatible foods are also there. And one of them is combining ghee and honey in equal quantities. Ghee is a health food. Honey is also a health food. So somebody may feel, why not take both of them? If you take both at the same meal in a decent amount and in equal quantity, same quantity of ghee and same quantity of honey, it is such a bad combination. It's called that it's not just Viruddhahar, it creates vish. Vish means poison. Now let's see whether the philosophy underlying Ayurveda makes sense. Yes, it does make sense, partly because it is a part of our heritage, it's part of our folk wisdom. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense to us. But then is it also rational? Yes, it is rational in its own way, because rationality can have, again, many angles. And one of the angles is that the way it talks about the individual, the seasons and the foods, and tries to combine them so that we can get the best out of this knowledge and stay healthy, is internally consistent. All this knowledge is internally consistent and therefore it is rational. Which means that it does make sense that if a person has kapha predominance, then he should not take foods which will aggravate kapha. Now, that is rational. We may not understand what kapha is, but that doesn't mean that the reason is lacking. So there's an internal consistency in all the recommendations of Ayurveda, and therefore it is rational. And what matters the most to us is, does it work? It has worked for millennia. It has worked for millennia and does work. Sometimes, we are not just happy with saying whether Ayurveda is rational. We start asking whether Ayurveda is scientific. Now, this is a modern phenomenon because during the last 400 years or so, science has been so successful at revolutionizing our lifestyle that the word scientific has come to be synonymous with whatever is good, valid, and worthwhile. But that is not the dictionary meaning of the word scientific. Because many things which are good, valid, and worthwhile may not be products of science and may not fit within the framework of science. But all the same, when people ask is Ayurveda scientific, they also don't necessarily always mean the same thing. Let's try and see what it may possibly mean. Scientific may mean, do we know the mechanisms by which this particular drug or this particular treatment works? If we don't know the mechanisms, then it is not scientific. But then there's hardly any treatment, the mechanisms of which we know in full detail. And therefore, ignorance of the mechanism by which it works does not necessarily make it unscientific. There are treatments used also in modern medicine, the mechanism for which is not fully known. In scientific, to another person may mean that can its rationale be understood in terms of modern science? No, generally it cannot be. But that doesn't mean that it is unscientific, because it does have a rationale and it is spoken in a language which was perhaps better understood a few thousand years ago. Even language and its usage changes with time. The fact that we can understand so much of it even today is itself a great achievement, in spite of all what we have lost through various means over these thousands of years. Enough has survived and enough can be understood to make a lot of sense to us. And therefore, we don't necessarily have to understand it in terms of modern science. If we can't understand it in terms of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats or calories, doesn't mean that it has no rationale of its own. Scientific to some people may mean, has its efficacy been proven by RCTs? RCT is a randomized controlled trial. We shall come to that a little more in detail a little later. And scientific to some may just mean, does it work? And they feel that it seems to work, but to be sure, let's conduct an RCT. That is one of the common knee-jerk responses. But then we'll see what an RCT is and what are the difficulties involved when it comes to Ayurveda. Before we turn to the RCTs, let's see what is the general attitude to Ayurveda. One of them is outright rejection. And what are the grounds for rejection? That it is unscientific, which means it does not satisfy one of these criteria, whatever criterion the person has chosen. If it doesn't satisfy that, it is unscientific and therefore it needs to be rejected. Or that it is irrational. Irrational the way person looks at it. It's old. It is old and therefore it's outdated, it is obsolete, it is no longer valid. We forget that the human body is much older than Ayurveda. So we have an extremely old and ancient body in the modern world. So if we have a few million years old body, why can't a few thousand-year-old system work for it? That we don't realize. The body has not changed much over the last few million years. The human body has not changed much. Then it is Indian. Now that is the inferiority complex which our rulers very successfully instilled in us in a few hundred years. And just because it is Indian, something Indian is bad, anything Western is better. So it's some of these reasons why Ayurveda gets rejected by Indians particularly. But then those who reject Ayurveda, how much do they know about Ayurveda? Probably very little most of the time, except what they perceive as folk knowledge, which also sometimes they accept and sometimes they reject depending upon what they find convenient. Now, these people generally swear by rationality. That is their most important, that it is irrational. But then how rational is it to reject something without knowing what you are rejecting? I think this is an extreme of irrationality to reject anything without knowing what you are rejecting. And yet they swear by rationality. There's another category of Indians who blindly accept Ayurveda. They accept it because it's old. Old is gold. So being old itself becomes a reason for accepting it blindly. Time-worn, time-honored, traditional knowledge. Therefore, it can be accepted. In fact, it should be accepted because it is old. Secondly, it's an Indian system. So, patriotic fervor. So it's a symbol of patriotism if we accept Ayurveda. Belief. Belief is something which is mental, but in the absence of adequate knowledge. Belief is something that we believe in. It's a mental attribute, not faith. Faith is different. Faith is at a level different from the intellect. Belief is an intellectual attribute, something which the intellect believes in, the thinking part of the mind believes in spite of the support being inadequate. The objective support being inadequate, still we believe. So I believe in Ayurveda. So just a belief is enough. Then personal experience. The way I have been also citing some instances. I had this, I did this, and then I became all right. I had this disease, I took this type Ayurvedic treatment, became all right. Such and such person, my friend, my relative had this problem and he became all right. So therefore, personal experience, our own or that of people near and dear to us, that becomes enough for us to blindly accept Ayurveda. But by and large, people who blindly accept Ayurveda also do not know much about Ayurveda. Now, when it comes to things being accepted or rejected because they are old, I found this quotation very interesting. One person, there are two kinds of fools. One says this is old, therefore it is good. The other says this is new, therefore it is better. Now, what is the third type of attitude? The most fashionable attitude. Conditional acceptance. I am ready to accept Ayurveda, but since its treatment has not been proven by research, let us do some research on Ayurvedic drugs using the methods of modern science, and if it is proven to be effective, I'll accept it. Now, this appears a very liberal type of an attitude, very generous attitude, or one might say a condescending attitude, whatever way you will like to put it. But this is the most fashionable attitude these days, conditional, especially among intellectuals, conditional acceptance. Once again, they do not know much about Ayurveda and they feel that this is the best way to get out of it. Get out of any controversy. But then how about those who know Ayurveda? The experts in Ayurveda. I have seen that they generally cannot make a good case in defense of Ayurveda. And that is why the image of Ayurveda does not improve. Because the previous three attitudes are taken by different people, and the acceptance and rejection, those are opposite attitudes, and therefore these two groups will be fighting each other all the time. The one who sort of can be passed off as a goody-goody person is the one who comes for the conditional acceptance. And those who are actually expected to be defending Ayurveda on the basis of what they know cannot make a good case of it. Why they can't, we'll not go into that. But there may be various reasons. At this point, you may just introspect and see where you stand and whether your stand has changed since we began this talk, and whether it will change any further at the end of the session. So where do you stand? Now let's come to this very glib expression. Let's test the new drugs. Let's test the Ayurvedic drugs using the methods of modern science. The gold standard for testing any new drug in modern medicine is what is called a placebo-controlled, double-blind, randomized controlled trial. Now, randomized because you have two groups which are randomized, which means that you have not made any conscious effort to put one person in one group and another in another. All these people have the same disease, more or less of the same severity, and yet you have randomized their allocation. So there's no systematic way in which you have tried to divide them into two groups. It's a totally random allocation to either the experimental group or the control group. The experimental group will get the new drug that is being tested, and the control group will get either no treatment at all, or more commonly a placebo. That's what's called placebo controlled. Placebo, could be just a sugar pill or something, which means something which has no active chemical, but looks exactly like the pill that is being given to those who are in the experimental group. So the two pills look alike, but one actually has the drug in it, and the other is an inert substance. So both the groups feel that we are getting the drug, But one group is getting the drug, the other is getting only a placebo. And why this is important is because modern medicine does recognize that part of the effect of any drug is because the person feels that I've taken this drug and therefore I'll get better. So it's a mind-body relationship at work rather than the pharmacological effect of the chemical being given in the pill. So that is why placebo controlled. So even the person who's getting the placebo thinks that I'm taking this drug and therefore he'll get better, and that much is the placebo effect. And in some situations, placebo effects can be remarkable. For example, in antidepressants, about half the effect is due to the placebo effect, which means if you give an actual antidepressant to a person, or whether you give this person an inert pill and tell him that I'm giving you an antidepressant, at least 50% of the effect will be seen also in the person who has received this inert pill. So that much can be the placebo effect. So that is why this placebo controlled. What is double blind? Because there are two types of blinding. The person who is getting the pill or the placebo does not know what he's getting. So that way he's blind to the treatment that he's being given. But who is the other person who is blind? The other person who is blind is the investigator, which means that the doctor who comes on the rounds every day and is conducting this experiment, even he does not know which patient is getting the pill and which is getting the placebo. Why? Because, then his attitude to these two groups of people may be different. And that may also influence the result. For example, if this person goes to a person who's actually getting the drug, he'll go and ask him almost confidently, how are you feeling? I'm sure you're feeling better today morning. I'm just dramatizing it. Whereas when he goes to the person who's getting a placebo, oh bechara, isko to dawai mili nahi rahi. So he'll be like, are you feeling better? Are you feeling better? So, he's just looking for, kahin keh de ki I'm feeling a little better so that I'll feel less guilty. So his attitude to these two types of patients will be different. So he's also blinded, which means that there's a code which only somebody, who is on the sidelines knows. And that code will be broken only when the study is over, who got the placebo and who got the pill. So this is double blinding. Now you say this is a wonderful way of testing a new drug. Why not apply it in case of Ayurvedic drugs? Now, we'll come to why it cannot be done in case of Ayurvedic drugs. Very difficult to blind. And very difficult to find a placebo in case of Ayurvedic treatment. And why that happens, we'll see a little more. One of the important requirements of the RCT is that we have two groups, an experimental control, which are randomized, and the two groups should be similar as far as possible, except with respect to one factor which is being studied, which is the new drug. Now let's see how easy or difficult it is to apply it in case of Ayurveda. We don't have people just sort of having the same disease of the same severity being considered identical. We also have to consider the prakriti of the person, which means that we have 7 types of patients, even if they have the same disease and the disease of the same severity. And therefore, if you have to make these groups really homogeneous, you'll need a much larger number of people, or you'll have to study each prakriti separately. Then, Ayurveda is much more than drug treatment. It uses massage, it may use mantras, it may use yogic postures. And as you can see, except for the drug, nothing else can be blinded and nothing else can be a placebo. Now, how can you have a placebo for yogic postures? The person knows I'm doing these yogic postures. Anyone who is watching him, the investigator also knows this person is doing yogic postures. How can you tell him that, jog and imagine as if you're doing yogic postures? So jogging can't be a placebo for yogic postures. So you can't have a placebo. In the same way, if the person is chanting a mantra, he knows I'm chanting a mantra. How can you tell him that, sing a song and imagine you are chanting a mantra? You can't have a song as a placebo for a mantra. So these are things which are impossible. And therefore, you can't have two groups which are identical in every respect except one thing, because Ayurveda is much more than drug treatment. And then another ticklish issue comes in. Ayurveda uses whole plants, whereas modern medicine is more geared towards active principle, that is the active chemical in the plant. So they're all the time trying to look what is it in this plant, even if it's an Ayurvedic preparation, which is actually working. And the effort is to try and isolate that, concentrate that, put it in a pill or a capsule, and then give that. Why take all the other redundant passive components of the whole plant? But then who declared them redundant and passive? Hmm? How do we know that the other components, while they may not be the active principle, are in some way supplementing through a synergistic effect the active principle, making it more effective? How do we know that those other components in the plant are not reducing the side effects? We do not know any of these. How do we know that the other principles are not improving the bioavailability of the drug? In the absence of all this knowledge, how can we say that everything else except the active principle is redundant and passive and therefore useless, and therefore let us isolate the active principle? And more than that, hardly any Ayurvedic preparation uses only one plant product. It uses so many of them together. So if we have to show that the active principle is not the only thing that is working, other components are also important. It is not only one herb which is working, the other 10 herbs which are there in the preparation also have a role. Then what we need is that we take each of these one by one and give it and see whether out of these 10, this one is the effective one, or this one. Or take one of them away at a time, whether these 9 work equally well, whether these 9 work equally well, these 9 out of these 10 work equally well, and then say, well, if these 9 work well, let's now take away one more. Do these 8 work equally well? Do these 8 work equally well? Now, it can be an endless process. Just studying one drug through this strict principle of having only one difference between the two groups and this analytic attitude of finding exactly what is working instead of the whole combination can keep a whole team of scientists busy for a lifetime. So those people who say that let's test Ayurvedic drugs through a randomized controlled trial don't understand Ayurveda and don't understand that randomized controlled trials cannot be applied here. Then it's not only 10 herbs that are being used, they have been processed in a particular way. Does that make a difference? Another set of experiments, process it the way Ayurveda says it, don't process it the way do it. Another set of experiments for all the 10 components. Seasonal changes in the treatment. Now, no change of treatment is permitted in a randomized controlled trial. Here you want seasonal changes. You want mid-course changes in the treatment in Ayurveda, depending upon the patient's response to the treatment. Those changes cannot be done. And add to that the faith and fears of the patient. In fact, one of the principles in Ayurveda is that if a patient is afraid of a treatment, don't give it to him. That person is unlikely to benefit from it. In fact, his fears may come true. If he thinks that this treatment will kill me, he may die because of the treatment. I'm putting it dramatically, but the fears of the patient are important. Now, with all these things, how can you test Ayurvedic treatment? In the same way as you test a new drug using a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trial. That is possible only in modern medicine, where by and large the principle is one size fits all. That is the only place where you can do it, and one drug, new drug at a time. And that is why Dr. Bhaswati Bhattacharya, whom you heard a few days ago in a Yes talk, and whom you will again hear day after tomorrow, she says in her book Everyday Ayurveda, RCTs bias all science towards drugs that can be masked, not lifestyle interventions. Because lifestyle interventions cannot be masked. They cannot be masked by blinding. They cannot be masked by a placebo. And because that cannot be done, the RCTs bias all science, which means that they bias science. And we feel that science is the last word in what is true. Just because it doesn't fit within the framework of science as we look at it, doesn't mean that it cannot be true. So RCTs create a very undesirable bias which works against lifestyle interventions and works in favor of drugs which may have plenty of side effects, which may be much more expensive. So all the non-pharmacological, inexpensive interventions in the lifestyle actually get pushed to a secondary place just because we think that if an RCT cannot prove it, then we should not accept it. Now, if this knowledge is so complex that one team of scientists can stay busy for more than a lifetime to even test one Ayurvedic formulation through the methods of modern science and still inadequately, just to test the drug part itself will keep them busy for a lifetime. Forget about the other components of treatment. then how did the ancients find it? One logical response would be by trial and error. There are thousands of years available, so they tried so many things, and whatever worked, they retained, whatever didn't work, they rejected, and that's how they arrived at this knowledge. To me, this looks rather simplistic way of looking at such complex knowledge, because no matter how many years we have at our disposal, through sheer trial and error, it's very difficult to accumulate this degree of complex knowledge where you are mixing 10, 20, 30 herbs sometimes at a time, processed in a particular way, and giving it in an individualized fashion to each patient, along with the other components of the treatment. This type of complex knowledge probably extremely unlikely to be arrived at by trial and error. The other guess could be through experimentation, through the type of experiments that modern science conducts. Again, unlikely, because we have seen what are the difficulties using the methods of modern science in the modern world, and to expect that they had some methods of experimentation which are better than we have now is again difficult to imagine. The third possibility is it was revealed knowledge. The divine has revealed the deeper truths of existence, that is, how the universe came into being, how the material universe came into being, and that the divine continues to be present in everything that it has created. Not only it continues to be present, it also continues to run the affairs of whatever it has created. It by and large controls the direction in which the universe is moving. Now, those deeper truths of existence were revealed to the rishis. The same creator who has revealed these has also packed the plants with those products which can keep us healthy, which can help when we are not well. And therefore, it's not impossible that this knowledge was also revealed to the rishis. And interestingly, the ancient physicians were actually not just physicians, they were also rishis. Once Professor Manoj Das, Manoj Das as we called him, was asked by a scientist where after modern science had discovered the beneficial effects of neem, that we have taken so long to discover all the beneficial effects of neem, how did the ancients discover it? Professor Manoj Das, they discovered it in the laboratory of consciousness. So it is it was his way of putting it in a more acceptable perhaps language, that it was knowledge that was revealed to the rishis. So it is the creator who has revealed the knowledge about the deeper truths of existence, is the one who designed self-healing in our bodies, and also the one who incorporated those healing chemicals in the plants which could provide a helping hand to these self-healing mechanisms in our body. And these secrets were also revealed to the same mystics, to the same rishis, and some of them decided to put this revealed knowledge in writing. And they put it in the same type of books in which they put the other deeper truths of existence. So then see the need of separating it into different books. Ayurveda is in fact an Upaveda of the Atharva Veda. And of course, further details have been added by Charaka, Susruta, Vagbhata, and Kashyap, and many more. And they were also, again, if not rishis, perhaps at least great thinkers and sages and saints, not just ordinary physicians. So that is Ayurveda for you. Not just drug treatment, but also massage, meditation, yogic postures, mantras, in fact, a holistic change in the way we live, in the way we spend our day. Dinacharya, Ritucharya, that is what we do during the day, what we do in different seasons. All this is a part of Ayurveda, not just the drugs with which it is sometimes identified. Suggested reading, Everyday Ayurveda by Dr. Bhaswati Bhattacharya. This is primarily about Dinacharya. That is how you spend the day. That's why the title Everyday Ayurveda doesn't have too much about food, but she has other books in which there will be, I'm sure, more about food. Then this book by David Frawley, Ayurveda and the Mind, again doesn't have too much about food, but an excellent book. And David Frawley also has several books on Ayurveda as well as other related subjects. And here is this Eating Wisely and Well, in which there is one chapter on Ayurvedic concepts. The title of the chapter is Old is Gold. And thank you all for listening.